So good morning to everyone. Welcome. You made it. You are in the virtual room in the right place right now to be on a Thursday morning at 11:45. The PPPC panel on the European Union and COVID-19. Is the July 2020 recovery plan strong enough? What does it say about EU solidarity? And with it, I would suggest to give it a gentle start. I welcome all of you to the first panel offered now after the introduction with our distinguished guests, Jim Cloos, Eleonora, Poli, and Carlos Gaspar. My name is Michael Kaeding, and I'm very happy and feel honored to chair this very first panel on a topic that could not be more topical as it is right now. The spread of COVID-19 has turned our world upside down. The pandemic has put enormous stress on the global economy and shown the limits of politics in its current forms. Its impact on the European Union, the member states, the neighboring countries poses probably one of the biggest challenge since the existence of the European Union integration process. And it's the latest stress test of Europe's solidarity after being plumbed by the Eurozone debt turmoil, the migration challenge, a changing geopolitical environment, Brexit, etc., etc., etc. Crisis after crisis. Now, I have the honor with the three distinguished guests to discuss with you the July 2020 recovery package and also European solidarity. We will start with Jim Cloos, Deputy Director General for General and Institutional Policy at the General Secretariat of the EU Council of Ministers. We will then move on with Eleonora Poli, Senior Fellow at the Istituto Affari, Internazionali, our Italian member, where she's working on democracy, institutions, and economic governance in the EU in the Western Balkans. And then we will have our third distinguished panelist with Carlos Gaspar, Senior Researcher at the Portuguese Institute of International Relations and Professor of International Relations at the Faculty of Human and Social Sciences at the New University of Lisboa. With those three distinguished guests, we will have a chance to discuss the topic. Each presenter will be given roughly 15 minutes. And after the three presentations, we will have sufficient room for your questions. Please make use either of the chat function or raise your arm so that we then can give you the floor to address the questions directly to the three experts around the table. And without further ado, I would hand over to you, Jim. Thanks for being with us. Thanks for your interest. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Michael. Hello to everybody. I'm very happy to be on this panel with two distinguished academics. What I will do is the following. I will make three introductory remarks, and then I will chart out the path towards the famous July agreement. Then I give a short evaluation of the agreement at the time. And then I will obviously have to say, unfortunately, something about the entry into force of the whole thing, because we have encountered a little roadblock. And I'll tell you where we are in this respect. First, three preliminary remarks. The first one is that the role of the European Council in COVID crisis, and in fact in any kind of crisis, is absolutely key. The reason for this is that apart from its traditional role on the MFFs have always been adopted at the level of the, not adopted, but politically agreed at the level of the European Council. The European Council is key when you talk about crisis management for a very simple reason. It is both the apex, in a way, of the institution of the council structure, because they are the bosses of the ministers sitting in the council, but it's also a club of national leaders who can use national resources. And they are the top leaders, the most democratically legitimate leaders in all of our member countries. If you look at the crisis management of the European Council, and unfortunately over at least the last 12 years, we have been in a kind of constant crisis mode, unfortunately, starting with the subprime crisis. If you look at it, the pattern is always a bit similar. The first phase is a bit of chaos. We're a bit all over the place, and we have to take stopgap measures. This is particularly the case in a situation like, for instance, for terrorism in 2004 or in COVID. We are talking about an issue where there is no clear-cut EU competence. The EU is not competent for health matters according to the treaty. Makes it more difficult. So we have a first phase which is a bit all over the place. And then meetings, the European Council finds a way to get together and to take stopgap measures. The second phase then is a very important phase in our system. It is that the European Council always tries then to set a framework for tackling the crisis. And I will explain how this happened for the COVID crisis. And the third phase is on the basis of this framework and the tasking by the European Council, actually decisions and implementation follow normally. My last introductory remark is to say that obviously the European Council is very central, but of course it cannot function without the other institutional actors and indeed the member countries. Because ours is an institutional system based on various legitimacies, the legitimacies of the Council, which represents the member states, legitimacy of the European Parliament, because it's directly elected, and of course a particular role for the Commission. Now, let me come to the path towards COVID. You remember all when it all started at the beginning of the year. The first phase, as I said, was a bit chaotic because for a very simple reason, member countries could not wait for consultation or coordination at the EU level. They had to take quick decisions. Some of them closed borders, others had to take emergency measures in terms of the health sector and all of that. What then happened is that the president of the European Council convened VTC meetings. It was impossible to have physical meetings at the time. And so the first phase was 2 VTC conferences of the members of the European Council. The first one on the 10th of March and the second on the 17th of March. What they did there is to look at 5 very urgent issues and tried to already either indicate a way forward or take measures or agree on coordination. And those 5 areas are the following. The first one is, of course, trying to limit the spread of the virus. The second one was getting medical equipment, including masks, because you all know that the Europeans, like many people in the world, were actually a bit wrong-footed by this and had to quickly act. The third one is vaccines, work on vaccines, which of course is a more longer-term issue. The fourth element, very important, and I'll come back to that much more a bit later, is the socio-economic effects of this crisis, which are of course huge. In this respect, it was very important that immediately the Commission would relax the state aid rules, allowing for national injections into the system. And it was also important to make sure, for instance, by the creation of green lines for the circulation of merchandise, that the value chains were not interrupted. And the fifth area was repatriation of Europeans. We collectively together, jointly working together, repatriated about 500,000 of Europeans who had been stranded abroad. Now that was the first phase. The second phase was basically another video conference on the 26th of March. This time, at the 2 first video conferences, there were only oral conclusions by the president. This time, there was a negotiated statement on the basis of a lot of preparatory work by Coreper. Why was this important? It was important because the leaders felt that they had to set on paper something which they had unanimously agreed and which would steer the Union in this difficult phase. Now, this statement did exactly that. It set the framework on the basis of those 5 elements I've described before, and it did something which the European Council also does very frequently. It first of all tasked President Michel and President von der Leyen to come forward with a roadmaps on exit and recovery. And very importantly, it also tasked the Eurogroup to address the socio-economic part. Now, it's interesting, as very often happens in the EU, there were about 25 paragraphs in this statement, all agreed easily, except for 2, and those 2 were about the socio-economic response, or part of it, and particularly this idea of a recovery fund. So the communication, very often the Union in terms of communication snatches defeat from the jaws of victory because it concentrates on the one point where they disagreed and not on the points where they agreed. Then, of course, we get into the 3rd phase, which was already more like a decision time. Now here, the next video conference on 23rd of April endorsed the roadmaps, and it also endorsed part of the work done in the Eurogroup on safety nets, amounting to 550 billion, the SURE, the ESM mechanism, and the EIB thing. And then it did again a tasking, but this one a different one. On the one point where the Eurogroup had not been able to agree, the question of a recovery fund, the European Council tasked the Commission to come forward with a major package which would combine the traditional MFF plus a recovery fund. So quite revolutionary. And the Commission, of course, started then working on this. What was important at this stage was that the question was no longer whether there should be a recovery fund, but how it should be constructed. Then a frantic period of negotiation started, which culminated in a meeting which lasted for 4 days and 5 nights here in this building in July, and which was a physical meeting. It could not have been done without a physical meeting. You are all familiar with the details of it, so I will not go into this in detail. I will simply say, is this a historic, as some people said it, a historic decision or a political agreement or not? I think it's very dangerous to say today whether something is historic. History has a habit of deciding itself what's becoming historical. What I would simply say is that there are ingredients in this which could reveal itself later on as having been historical. So I'll quickly go through those 5 points which I want to make in this. But repeating again, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. The first one is the sheer size of the package, 1.07 trillion over 7 years for the traditional MFF, plus 750 billion of commitments which have to be done by 2023, which is the famous recovery package. Plus, we have to add the 550 billion of the safety nets. We have to add the massive effort, 1.3 trillion of the European Central Bank buying bonds, and of course the national injections. So the size is absolutely phenomenal. Secondly, the architecture. There it's a very interesting architecture with an imbrication between recovery and MFF. What is really interesting is that for the first time, the EU is massively borrowing on the bond market. The Commission is doing that for the EU. But, and this money will then be not only lent on forward, that we had done for sure, for instance, but 390 billion out of this will be transferred as grants. So that is a relatively revolutionary approach. We see that, for instance, the money which is being raised for sure has already been oversubscribed between 10 and 15 times. So I think we have a good rating. Now, what is interesting is that this will transform the EU as a major actor on the bond market. My third point is the repayment angle, because the money has to be repaid, of course. Now, obviously, and the budget of the European Union is the guarantor. That is why the ceiling of the own resources had to be increased by 0.6% to show the markets we have the means to repay. That means, of course, that it means that you have basically three ways of paying back. One would be that you increase the contributions of the member states to the budget, not a very palatable solution. The second one is to lower the expenditure, not very nice either. We are already very low with 1% of GNI. And the third one is to create new own resources. And so this will give a boost to new own resources. The leaders already, for the first time in a long time, decided on a very modest new own resource linked to the use of plastics. But they also set out a roadmap towards more of those own resources. So historically speaking, this could be a push to more own resources, which is a very difficult theme, of course, in the EU. The fourth point is that you might have thought that because of this, the green or digital agenda would disappear because people say we simply have to restore the economy. But in fact, the message of the leaders is the opposite. We have to press ahead with, for instance, climate change. 30% minimum of the expenditures for this revolution, both for the recovery fund and for the MFF. And the fifth point I want to make simply is that by sending out this signal, the European Union has also done something potentially, if it all works, for its geopolitical stance. Of course, at the same time, we have to also be a bit modest. This is a one-off initiative, at least for the time being. There is no absolute guarantee on getting unanimity and ratification later on new own resources. We have not created a Euro budget. So I think what has been done is very important, but at the same time, we should also stay realistic. Now, my last quick point, I think I have still 2 minutes or 3?
2 minutes, yes.
2 minutes. So very briefly, this has to be translated that into text. This means that, for instance, there are 3 things. The MFF regulation, unanimity in the Council, we've reached that, and consent by Parliament. We have done a deal with the Parliament. Basically, that issue is settled. Secondly, the own resources decision has to be sent to the member countries and ratified. That's still a big thing out of it. And thirdly, we have all the legal basis, the regulations which are decided in co-decision, where we're quite advanced. Now we've run into a roadblock because on all of this, there's basically agreement, but there is one issue which has created a problem. That is that in the context of this package, there is a conditionality text, a conditionality and rule of laws text, which should ensure that the money is spent in line with good practice and all of that and the law. And this, there was a political agreement on the text in the July text, but 2 delegations interpret this text differently and think that what the Germans have negotiated with the Parliament, because there is an agreement, there is a qualified majority in the Council on that, they consider that this is not in line with the European Council. And that is why they say they cannot block this because it's qualified majority. But they say for this, for us, it's so important. So we cannot give our consent to the formalization of the MFF by unanimity, nor the own decision, own resources decision. So we are in a difficult situation. I will not go into the detail. There are talks about this behind the scenes. I will simply say my own assessment is this is a serious issue. And of course, if it would scupper the overall agreement, it would be a disaster. I do not think that in the end this will happen. As always, the Union will find a way, but we are wasting time, we are losing some time. And since we need the ratification of the own resources decision in the member countries, the recovery fund cannot start before that has happened. So it is serious. I don't think it's desperate. I cannot imagine for a second that a 1.8 trillion package will founder in the end on this. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Jim. You set the scene, and we can very nicely move on now with Eleonora Poli to basically elaborate now on whether this is the way to make the Union more strategically and politically cohesive, and specifically focusing in her intervention on the socio-economic challenges ahead, with a particular focus on populism across Europe. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you to TEPSA for inviting me to this interesting event. I would start by saying that, well, if there is any positive side of all the horrific economic and social consequences of the COVID-19 crisis, is the fact that the European Union has been able, European Union and the institutions have been able to find a degree of plans and solutions that go beyond the minimum common denominator. There is an interesting poll and survey developed by ACFR, which is called Solidarity Tracker, where you can actually find the number and the level of actions of solidarity performed by the EU institutions and member countries. And it's actually quite interesting to see the level of both, European solidarity, but also member state to member state solidarity. So you can see and say that solidarity among European countries is there. It's true that at the beginning solidarity was lacking, but it's also true that when the pandemic was realized as a pandemic, so member countries started to believe and see that it was an unprecedented crisis, European Union and member countries started to react appropriately. So the set of plans put forward by EU institutions is certainly unprecedented for the level of fiscal flexibility and solidarity. This is for sure. And it's true that those plans have been linked mainly to the COVID crisis, but they represent, I think, a solid basis for a new European model based on more strategic and political cohesion. Of course, the effectiveness of those plans, I'm talking about Next Generation EU, but also other plans such as the SURE plan or the intervention by the ECB, or again, the fiscal flexibility. The effectiveness of all this package depends on several factors, such as Jim was saying, the speedy, the amount of time it will take member countries to agree on the EU budget, but also on other factors such as the capability of member countries to actually address several forms of insecurity which are present among European citizens, and the ability of those countries also to perform structural reforms, because we already have appropriate funding. I would say, of course, better can be achieved in the future, but for the moment, I would say that the amount of funding is there, and it's time for member countries to find, to be brave enough, basically, to find agreements, go beyond national interest, and also perform structural reforms. The veto imposed by Poland and Hungary on the EU budget actually is, I was quite astonished, because although, first of all, it's not in the interest of their own countries, but also, the link to the rule of law is an excuse, in the sense that Poland and Hungary have been signed and ratifying agreement before the COVID-19 crisis. And those agreements and those treaties basically were based on a precise idea of rule of law, liberty and democracy. And if you agree to European projects, you have to agree to the whole package. And we cannot, as Europeans, we cannot believe in building, a better Europe, a better European model without having a common base of values, basically, which are based on democracy, freedom, and rule of law. Leaving aside this issue, which is, I also think that will be solved, but it represents an intrinsic problem of Europe, which is basically how much, national interest or national egoism can kind of block basically the rest of Europe, and we can discuss how much democratic is that. I think the second issue is the necessity by member countries to push forward structural reforms. So the national plan, how to implement, how to spend basically this funding coming from the European Union. And this is quite interesting, because there was a recent poll by ACFR about the so-called frugal countries. I don't like this term, but this is how they are called at the moment, unfortunately. We were the pigs, now there is also the frugal. So the poll was about Finland, Austria, and the Netherlands. And it was interesting to see how, you know, the majority of citizens there do not, and they are fine basically with the idea of having European funding for countries. 8 out of 10 citizens actually agree with the European policy for a recovery fund. The main issue there is that they fear basically that some countries, and I would say Mediterranean countries, will not be able to spend those money in an efficient way because, and this is, you know, a sort of old story, you know, the constant contrast between the north and the south of Europe, whereby the north think, and actually is also somehow right, that the south is not performing well, not because of the Eurozone, but because it's not competitive enough. And this is partially true. So it's time, you know, for member countries, and I'm talking about, for instance, Southern European member countries, to perform those structural reforms that before were not possible because of lack of funding. This is a good moment to do that, especially because another element of insecurity, which is not affected just Southern European countries, but actually all Europe, is social and economic malaise, which has been growing basically due to the COVID crisis. And for the first time, we are facing a crisis which is a sort of horizontal crisis, in the sense that although not all member countries basically have been affected in the same way in terms of number of cases by the COVID crisis, the social economic consequences have been the same in all European member countries. Unemployment is going to grow to 8.1% in 2021. And unemployment has always been, since 2008, a sort of main issue affecting basically the structure of European economy. Is a fundamental issue that European member countries have to address, because unemployment is affecting mostly the youth, and is also, it has serious consequences on the gender gap. We can see that especially now in the COVID crisis, where you can see that in all European member countries, female workers have been the most excluded by, you know, work at the moment, both because they tend to work more on services, which were the one mostly affected by the COVID crisis and the lockdowns, and also because most of the time they are the one taking care about children. And with the closure of schools, of course, they had not to work. Sometimes they opt not to work, or they didn't have any other choice. And this is important, not just as a sort of need for evolution, or is a civil evolution, but it's also important in economic terms, because you have a huge part of the society which is not contributing basically to economic growth or to basically innovation. That's why, you know, it's very important now that member countries will implement a set of plans that are actually will look at what are, you know, citizens' fear or forms of insecurity, which mostly are at the moment economic insecurity. If you look at data, is it true that at the moment the majority of Europeans are actually in favor of the European Union? You have around 65% of citizens that actually believe in the European Union, and 61% still believe that the European Union, the actions of the European Union were positive during the COVID crisis. But European member countries should look at the rest, at the other 30%. Because on these 30%, populist parties will build their campaign, and they might be successful. This depends on how well governments in the rest of Europe, in the European Union, will perform. In the US, Trump did not win the election, but Trump is not over. A huge number of people voted for Trump, and you have a so-called huge minority which is still sustaining Trump. The same is in Europe. It's true that we are not talking a lot about populism at the moment, because the COVID pandemic is basically taking the stage all over, but populism is still there. And with populism, I mean also Euroscepticism, and the idea that we need to blame the European Union for every failure we are facing at economic and social level. To do that, I think, you know, to face that, I think for the time, member countries have both, you know, the meanings and the capacity to, you know, perform correctly through, you know, national plan that actually will tackle social issues. Because is it true that there are social and economic insecurity? They are real, they are not, fake news. And we should address those issues in order, to overcome, overcome this kind of insecurity on which, Euroscepticism and populism is based all over Europe. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Eleonora, for your insights here, specifically on the socio-economic consequences here, with a particular focus also on the youth and on the gender question, but not least the issue related to populism in Europe, populist parties to be found on the right and left political spectrum. And this will give me the chance to hand over to our third distinguished guest expert on this panel, Carlos Gaspar. He will come back. I have the slight doubt on a more critical note, and I will give you the floor immediately, specifically focusing on the return of the state and its decisive role in addressing the pandemics in the European Union, and as you phrase it, the more protectionist temptation of the EU manifest you see in the recovery strategy of the European Union. Carlos, the floor is yours. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Michael. May I start by my remarks by going back to the issue of the recovery plan, which I find actually a very remarkable plan, and most of all, I would like to stress that the European Union institutions were able, in this crisis, unlike other crises, to speed up their response, as was very well shown by Jim Cloos. This is an unprecedented response, but it is also a crisis that was settled, assuming that all goes well in the trialogue between Germany, Hungary, and Poland, that was settled at unprecedented speed. And this contrasts very much with previous crises. And I know that in Greece, in Portugal, in Ireland, or in Spain, even Italy, this will be a very important point in evaluating the recovery plan. I would like to stress also the key role of France in the initial phase of responding to the crisis, with the letter of the 9 member states, of which Italy was also a part, Spain, also Portugal. This letter of March 25th preceded the Franco-German initiative of 18 May. And this initiative, I think, reflected very much the strategic vision of President Macron, and it's framed within the concept of the souveraineté européenne, of this new vision of European sovereignty, and the need to lead the way towards recovering or building up European strategic autonomy in all the key relevant dimensions, technology, industry, supplies, and even defense. Let me also stress the role of the key role of Germany in bringing together the 27 or at least 25 member states up to now, and to approve the European Commission recovery plan in this critical summit in last July. Germany, in this process, consolidated its status as the central power in the European Union. Berlin alone is able to overcome the tensions between North and South Europe and between East and West Europe. And its capacity as a balancer is being put to the test as we speak in the runoff for the next European Council. Also, I think that the plan very much gives a new meaning to solidarity, and this is recognized in the post, namely European Council on Foreign Relations Solidarity Tracker, which Eleonora Poli just mentioned. And it also, I think, if everything goes well, this plan will go a long way in restoring confidence and commitment to the European Union institutions as an indispensable player in responding to the social and economic consequences of the COVID pandemic, and in containing the rise of populist and anti-European parties and forces, which is a key issue in addressing the next political period after the pandemic recedes with the vaccine campaign. And Eleonora was saying the populist strength is there. We do not know very well how to evaluate it right now, because it's in a sense concealed by the pandemics, but the social and economic consequences of the crisis should force us to look at this issue with great urgency. In fact, the sense of the recovery plan, it will be then put to the test if it's able to contain this surge of the populist anti-European parties or not in the very next elections. We have elections in Germany in 2021, and especially we have French elections in 2022. And the last French election, the last French presidential election, was the first European election which was fought on the issue of European integration, and it might be again be the case. The surge, I think, or the comeback of the European Union, again, assuming all goes well in the trialogue, is not the only remarkable consequence of the COVID-19 crisis in Europolitics. I would like to refer very briefly to three trends which were revealed or accelerated by the COVID-19 crisis. And the first one is, as Michael was referring to at the beginning, first is the comeback of the national state. You have at once the comeback of the European Union, a strengthening of the European integration, and the comeback of the national state. We are not absolutely sure if the two will work together or not, but we have to look at the situation addressing both the reinforcement of European integration and the reinforcement of the national state. The evidence is there. I mean, the national state, the European Union, the European Commission has no competencies on national health. So obviously it fell to the national states to respond to the health crisis in the member states. And they had an expanded role in exercising emergency powers, in imposing successive lockdowns and mobilizing additional resources, namely to the national health systems in each country. Of course, this was made possible by the fact that the Eurozone rules were suspended to allow for a significant increase in public spending. Further expansion of the state is also evident and unprecedented in the state intervention to rescue business enterprises and to ensure that the vast majority of employees, workers, civil servants does not suffer a significant loss of revenues during the crisis. And this was achieved to a very remarkable extent. In the last evaluation of the Bruges Institute, in France, 95% of employees have not lost revenues during this terrible pandemic. I don't know if it is sustainable, but it's there, and it's in itself a remarkable achievement of the French state. And of course, the performance of the states in addressing the health crisis and also its economic and social consequences will be the main issue after the pandemics. My second remark would be on the what I call the protectionist temptation, because as we strengthen the European integration project, taking advantage of the crisis, we have set a certain number of policies which were very well outlined in the Franco-Germany initiative, which go towards building up European strategic autonomy. This means further controls in external investments, external meaning mainly China, in imposing new regulations on key areas, namely in the digital areas. This is also a way of containing the strength of the American business enterprises in this new digital industry, and also very much to the point in diversifying, I think is the official term, supply chains, which means for many countries relocalizing industrial production in Europe proper, and not only diversifying, meaning lessening the dependency, namely on global chains, and namely on China as the center of this global supply chains at this moment. But reinforcing, building up strategic autonomy, and at the moment when in a sense we are witnessing a steep decline in globalization, means in a sense building up also the borders to our own European space. And this, in conjunction with the view of geopolitical Europe, makes, in my view, for a tendency towards regional protectionism, and which is, I think, of course, most leaders will deny this, but it is, I think, a very strong tendency that will fit on itself and on the changing international circumstances. If I may, a very brief last remark, which comes along.
2 minutes, please. 2 more minutes, yeah.
I think that I've been also looking at the European polls, both in ECFR and now the Berlin Pulse and the Pew poll on Europe. And in fact, at this moment, there is a strong surge in public support for the European Union and European integration, and its response to the COVID crisis is very important. But at the same time, there is an estrangement of European public opinion vis-à-vis the United States, China, and of course, Russia. And this, I think, can be interpreted there are many good reasons for all this, of course, but this can be interpreted, and the fact that it's been aggravated during the pandemic crisis, we can interpret this shift in public opinion as, in a sense, a closure of the Europeans within the European Union, adding to the protectionist temptation and isolationist trends, which in turn gives a new meaning to the new geopolitical Europe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carlos, for your intervention. You, I think, elaborated very nicely on particular individual countries, here specifically focusing on France and also Germany's U-turn happening over the summer 2020. You focused also on the issue of populism, very right so. We have discussions also in Portugal. I will leave it up to you to go in that direction if you want later on the Q&A session. For the first time, something appearing regionally that Portugal as such had not seen so far. You have been elaborating on the return of the EU and the nation state more generally and the protectionist temptation, and outlined at the very end on the turn and the changes in public opinion vis-a-vis China, the US, Russia, etc. And this would give me now the opportunity to open the floor to your questions. In the meantime, we have 70 participants in this panel. The numbers keep on rising, so the word is spreading, so to say. And I would start with Jaap de Zwaan and hand over right away after Jaap's question to Ramunas, who has the next question. And I would prefer to collect questions and then maybe a third one with Paul to collect these three questions and then to give it a first round. We have 30 minutes in total, so I hope that to have 1, 2, 3 rounds all together. But let's get started with Jaap first, please.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you for the presentations. I have a question or a comment with regard to the very sensitive rule of law dilemma. Perhaps I better address this question to Jim. The point is, as a lawyer, of course, you can think that the requirement to have the rule of law standards respected is always there. I mean, we have Article 2, we have the Charter, we have Article 7, whatever you like. So the need to respect the rule of law is always there. The question therefore arises, but it's a very tricky one, whether it was wise to provide so explicitly for political decision-making in this regard, because you can be sure from a start that in the end, such a case, if there will be a political decision regarding violation of whatever kind of fundamental value, the case will be brought before the Court of Justice. Now, therefore, the question arises whether it would not be better to provide for a primary role of the Court of Justice, which is an institution very capable, and you could frame such a procedure in the format of a fast-track procedure. I've seen in my practice as the agent of the Netherlands government many examples of fast-track procedures. It can work very swiftly, very smoothly. Now, funny enough, when we drafted, and also in that regard, I was involved in the negotiations, when we drafted the first version of Article 7 of the Treaty on European Union, we deliberately left out a role of the Court of Justice because we didn't want to have them too intensely involved in these kinds of sensitive issues. However, that's my point, in practice, it seems that we cannot do without them. So what's your take on that? Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much for your comment and very concrete question. I would hand over to Ramunas to come up with the next question and his question around whether or not we are standing yet again in front of a Hamiltonian moment. The floor is yours, Ramunas.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks to all three speakers for interesting interventions. Yes, as Michael mentioned, my question to all three speakers is, what is your opinion in this debate whether the July decisions regarding economic recovery fund, especially also EU funding for the next financial perspective more generally, are a leap towards fiscal union, or you think it's just temporary crisis management mechanism that will be terminated after next few years? Or if you think it's still too early to tell, maybe you can say what are the main uncertainties that will determine which of these two scenarios is more likely. Thank you very much.
Excellent. And I take on board a third question by Paul Schmidt. Please, Paul.
Yes, thank you very much, Michael, and thank you very much to all the speakers for an interesting input. No, my question is a follow-up question to the one which I posed to Anna a couple of, well, 1 hour, 2 hours ago. Jim, we're almost off record here, almost. What is your take on the MFF and Next Generation EU package? Do you think that in case the veto is prolonged, a way of doing it via enhanced cooperation would be a way to go? Also keeping in mind what Eleonora implied and others tell us, that the rapid implementation and the efficiency of the Corona financial help is so important at this very important time. Also keeping in mind what Cloos said regarding the social economic consequences which will take place. How do you see that option if we cannot sort it out in a different way? Thank you.
Excellent. So we have now 3 questions on the floor next to the interventions. So I would kindly invite now, following the order of the presenters, starting with Jim, continuing with Eleonora, and then with Cloos, to pick up on these 3 questions as you wish, but also if you want to actually connect and also react to the other contributions of the other speakers on the panel. The floor is yours, Jim.
Thank you very much. I would love to do both, but I don't want to be too long. I simply say that I agreed with Eleonora and Cloos mostly, I think very much. Concerning Cloos' point on the strategic autonomy, I understand his fear. There is an element of it, but I am pretty sure that the Union, simply because it cannot afford to become protectionist, we are the major trading power in the world, it would be shooting ourselves in the foot. And it's not either autarky. I don't think that's what we're talking about. I think the strategic autonomy debate is the most important debate we now have. But I do not dispute that. I perfectly understand why Cloos made the point. I think you can make that point, but I think there are solutions. Let me quickly turn to one point which Eleonora made, which is really important, is the importance of the national programs to really use that money well. We all know the history of this. And so this is a point I cannot overemphasize enough. Quickly, those are 3 excellent, I must say, questions. Jaap's one is a very complicated one. I have to be a bit careful because I'm still sitting in a very active position here, even it's not a public session. I have a lot of sympathy with what Jaap says. Very personally, I have always been a bit careful about this question of linking rule of law directly to the MFF and the budget. Why? Also, our legal service had some doubts about this. And that is why actually we're not now talking about a rule of law regulation. We're talking about a conditionality thing with some link to rule of law. Why? Because it's very difficult to establish. And I do not want to defend anybody, but what Jaap said is interesting. No one contests that the rule of law is important and the treaty has to be respected and all of that. What the Hungarians and the Poles say is that we have a Court of Justice, we have an Article 7. Why are we creating something with the budget which we fear could be misused politically? And the Poles were particularly talking about the way the Commission conducted the Article 7 thing. I'm not giving any value judgment. I simply say what the argument was, and that they feel that the way this is worded could be misused politically. So I think that's just to be clear about the background of this, but it's a very difficult question. I personally think that the question of the Court of Justice is absolutely key, and I think Jaap knows this very well. On Ramunas's question, well, one will only know if it's a Hamiltonian moment, as I said much later. I think when Hamilton made his proposals and with the Federalists at the time of the American Revolution, he did not say, is this a Hamiltonian or whichever movement? I mean, this came much later. But the point is, I think your question is absolutely right. This could be a major step towards a fiscal union. It could be, but it's not necessarily one. Because for the time being, this is crisis management. And it's very clear that the Frugals and the Germans were very clear. They insisted on the commitment period being short, up till 23. The Commission had proposed 24 for precisely these reasons. They also insisted on early start of repayment. So the jury is out. It all depends a lot on what will happen in the own resources debate. I personally tend to believe that it is to some extent a move towards the fiscal union, because I do believe the pressure for the repayment will be quite big, and that we may probably see some movement in terms of own resources in the next 5 years. That's my answer to this question. But we have to be very careful also in terms of the scheme to go and borrow to then hand on to member countries. For the Frugals, this is a one-off thing, very clearly. On the other hand, if this works out well, I simply speculate, and it really works, and the member countries do national plans which are really good, and they make reforms, then I think if we hit another big roadblock, you never know. I mean, we will obviously say this is not a precedent, but whenever you say this is not a precedent, it tends to become one. Last point on Paul's point, I have to be really careful here, because this is, first of all, we start from the assumption that we should get this package through. Because anything else will cost a lot of time and be very complicated. There's no easy solution on this for many reasons. I cannot go into the details. I would say at the same time, as an observer of politics in Europe for the long time, that if there were to be a definitive blockage on this, I am absolutely certain that institutions and the other member states would try to be inventive and find a way around. That much I can say. I cannot go into the detail of this. I still very much hope that this will not be necessary, because it would be complicated.
Thank you. Let's continue right away. Eleonora, please, the floor is yours.
Yes, I agree with what Jill was saying, and basically what I would add is that I would like to believe that basically this is the basis for, a new Europe, a real next generation Europe, I would say. And so with everything that it entails, so, fiscal union, maybe more political union, etc. This is my personal dream, but looking at the reality, I think very much will depend on how member countries will perform at national level. This is the fundamental issue. And since our economies are already very much interconnected and already in an economic union, the thing is that member countries should not think how to perform well in their countries, but they should also think how other countries could allow countries to perform well. In this sense, we should not act in a sort of competitive manners all the time, but we should really try to find, what is the best plan for, each national member countries, looking also at what others are saying, basically. And this is linked exactly to, my comment before about the frugal countries. So in the case of Italy, which is my country, we need an Italian plan, but we need an Italian plan which is, in harmonic, working harmonically with other, European national plans. That's and it's very difficult. There is a lot of stake, but since, for the first time, maybe we are facing a crisis which is affecting all countries at the same level, this is the right opportunity to build something better. This is my personal conviction, and I hope that things will work out. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Carlos, please.
Thank you. Thank you. I take Jim's point that protectionism would very much hurt the European Union, and perhaps the European Union most of all among the various poles in the international system. My point is, how can we resist this trend towards the fragmentation of the international system and the building up of regional spheres and technological spheres of influence, which is on the move? Certainly, we should oppose it, but can we? Do we have what it takes to oppose this very important, very strong dynamics in the international system? So there is a tension, even as we draw up new policies in the framework of this recovery plan, on the need to build up strategic autonomy and put in place some protectionist policies. The digital policies are protectionist policies, excluding the Chinese businesses from the 5Gs is a protectionist policies, of course, with excellent grounds. I will not dispute the grounds, but they go in this sense, in a defensive protectionist sense. And I don't know if we can resist this international trend in the European Union. I don't know the question of Ramuna's, which scenario is the more likely, but I would wait until the German election of 2021 and what is the new coalition that will come out of this election. And of course, it is very important that until then, it's less than a year away, until then, we are able to overcome the veto from Hungary and Poland, and we are also able, as Eleonora was saying, to make good, especially in the Southern European countries, to make good of the recovery plans and to take on the funds as instruments for the modernization of our economies. Finally, I would say that any delay, any major delay in the release of the funds could have very negative effects for the Portuguese socialist minority government, which has in fact put everything at stake in this recovery plan. And as a minority government, I mean, the conjunction of the social and economic consequences of the pandemics plus uncertainty vis-a-vis the recovery plan could have very serious consequences. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would open then for the next round of questions and start with Alex Conway. Please, the floor is yours.
Hi, thanks very much. From Ireland, so I understand the comments about the pigs quite well earlier on. It's quite nice. My question is about strategic autonomy. I would say I would agree that it is the most important debate maybe going on in the EU at the moment, but much, if all of the framing that I can see about it is about what it's not. Much as Baldrick in Blackadder talks about what a dog is, it's not a cat. And Charles Michel effectively says the same thing. So can I ask, what exactly is strategic autonomy in the sense of trade policy, industrial policy, competition policy, as opposed to what it's not? Because I think that's the fear in Ireland, especially about what it isn't and what it's against. So that would be my question. What is it what's the positive spin? What is the positive message of strategic autonomy apart from its protectionism, but also not really?
Thank you very much, Alex. Are there any other questions? I just have a quick look. Those having their cameras on, whether there is any. I have a look at whether you have raised your hands at the participants list. I have a look. Yes, there is Joana Lopez. The floor is yours if you would like, or I can also read out the question, but I would rather prefer you to unmute you if that's okay, if that's possible. Joana? Okay, that's not a problem at all. Ah, yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, excellent. Okay. The floor is yours. Go for it.
Yes, my question is connected to the last intervention by Professor Carlos Gaspar. I would like to ask all the speakers if, as part of this recovery plan, the allocation of funds within the Recovery and Resilience Facility Fund, what is the role for national clusters within the EU member states? I give the example of Spain and Portugal because we are very close geographically, but we can consider other cases. If it's possible for these clusters to have an effective role, if we take into account the context of greater competition for markets within the EU member states and partners outside of the EU, like USA and China and others. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. Since these questions also were directly addressed to Carlos, to start off with, I would suggest that we start with him and go the opposite direction, continuing then after Carlos with Eleonora, and then to close up with Jim Cloos, if that's okay. Carlos, the floor would be yours now, with the final words.
Thank you. Yes, my answer to Joana Lopes would be that a cluster, an IPRI cluster of Portugal and Spain could be very effective in market competition. Although I don't know if the convergence, the actual convergence of policies between Spain and Portugal is leading into that direction. But perhaps there are new policies which are structured by this recovery fund, which can bring about a more coordinated response of both Portugal and Spain. Yes. On strategic autonomy, I think that the best thing about strategic autonomy so far is that we don't know very well what it is. And ambiguity, I think, is very much an important tool in politics generally, and especially in European politics. But what I read into the language of the Franco-German initiative was this a certain tension between a relocalization of industrial supply chains, namely, it's very strong in the case of the French strategy, and the diversification of supply chains, which means finding new external partners and not concentrating supply chains mainly on China. Relations with Japan and South Korea, of course, are very much a case in point, but also with India, it's important, and for North African countries are relevant in this redefinition of supply chains. Strategic autonomy also has a strong meaning in defense and security policies, but I think that's yet another very large question. I imagine it's very important for Ireland, and that Ireland would have a different perspective than other members, which are NATO members, and strategic autonomy I think in defense and security has a different meaning for member states which are members of NATO and those which are not members of NATO. But I think there is a lot of work to do in this defense and security area, in the sense that we should look to the new administration in the United States as a period of opportunity to move towards strategic autonomy in defense and security. A short window of opportunity. We don't know what comes next, and we don't want to know what comes next. We have to do what we have to do in the next 4 years. This is not reflected in the recovery plan, but I hope that the European Council can address this issue very shortly, I hope. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos, also for your final remarks. I would hand over to Eleonora also for your final comments on this panel today. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I would like to add something on strategic autonomy. Of course, as it was said by Carlos, it means different things according to the angle you consider, like trade or security and defense. If you consider trade, yes, it might mean a bit of protectionism, but if you consider security, it might mean the capacity of the EU to defend herself. But I think, the main thing is that we have now realized that, the European Union is not in the center of the world. We have been realizing it in the I think, past years already. And it's time for the EU actually to be able to be effective, both internally and externally, in the external arena and in the internal platform. And for doing that, it has to have a sort of autonomy in its decision-making process, in the way it performs economically, and also in this foreign policy. And I think this strategic autonomy concept is mostly linked also to the trend we have been facing with the Atlantic side, in the fact that the US has been basically from being our main ally and being there all the time, the European Union needed them to be there. They have been, progressively detaching from the European Union. So I think the main factor that pushes you to say that we need more strategic autonomy is the fact of realizing the US is not there, is not going to be always there for us, and we need actually to grow basically as a union with the capacity to face, internal and external challenges. As far as cluster is concerned, I would say that from a political point of view, having cluster of European countries, being together to find common solution is what is going on now. I would encourage more southern cluster, in the sense that more cooperation from southern member countries would be optimal for southern countries themselves. We are not always the best in doing that, but I think especially now, since we are facing common problems, this is what's happening. Thank you.
Excellent. And Jim, please.
Yes, thank you very much. On strategic autonomy, first of all, this debate arose, you have to set the context here. It arose after 2016. Why? Because of Brexit, the challenge of Brexit, because the challenge of Trump, and now the challenge of COVID. So you have to see it against that background. For the Union, in a world of beasts like the Chinese or the Russians or the Turks, all relatively autocratic governments, and a United States where Trump now will no longer be there, but Trumpism will still be. The Union has to be able to shape its own way of doing things, to defend its interests and its values. Now, I said before, strategic autonomy is not a very well-defined thing, but as Carlos says, that sometimes has an advantage, but it asks the right question. It is not autarky, it's not protectionism, and it's certainly not isolationism. I can't imagine a European Union which would be isolationist. On trade, Alex, I think it was, I have to say, there is quite a gap between protectionism and defending your interests in a reasonable way. First of all, we are big proponents of the WTO. We should try and enlist the Americans to again become proponents of that. We want a multilateral framework. At the same time, I think there's nothing protectionist in telling the Chinese and others that we want a level playing field. We want them to respect the WTO rules. We want some reciprocity. I am very sorry, that's not protectionist, because we cannot accept that some simply do not play the game, and we cannot do anything about it. So we have to push for multilateralism, and it doesn't work. We have to have the instrument to look at what's happening, including looking at incoming investments. So I think this is only logical. My last remark on strategic autonomy is the following. You have to see it in a broad-based approach. If you look only at it from the military and security standpoint, then you easily lapse into what, like the German defense minister says, oh, you're going to attack NATO. No, of course not. That should not be the idea. If you look at trade, it's a different issue. I look at it in all the areas. Energy. I look at it in terms of climate change. I look at it in terms of digital. It's a very broad approach. In terms of trade, coming back to that, or energy, it is not about relocalizing every single thing in Europe. There might be some strategically really important issues. I was very shocked as a European that we cannot, we don't have any production of paracetamol anymore in Europe. I think there's a problem there. I have no problem importing a lot of it from China, India, and other places, but not 100%. So it's about diversification. On energy, we will always import energy. We cannot do otherwise, but we should diversify it. And we should, of course, make an effort to be better in terms of energy consumption here and all of that. So I look at this in a global way. Concerning Joanna's, I see we have passed the hour. So on Joanna's point, I would simply say what she says is very much the DNA of the European Union. That's what we're trying to do. We try to push this even via structural funds. There are special structural funds programs which are transnational. We very often impose that for certain projects, people cluster or they work together. There are several participants from at least 3 member countries and all of that. So the answer is it really depends on the member countries here to do. The more they do this kind of thing, the better it is. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And with this, we come to an end of this first panel on EU and COVID-19 pandemic of this PPC in Lisboa. Let's have a look at the own resource debate that seems to be key in the coming hours and days. Let's not forget that member states do play an important role in not only shaping EU politics, but also implementing European politics. That will be key, and that is one of the key messages also. And we need to keep reforming those sovereign member states. Not to forget that Euroscepticism is there to stay. It might be concealed right now, but it will come back and will be on the agenda back. It is already on the agenda back in some of our member states. So we shouldn't forget about this. And last but not least, one of my TEPSA friends wrote in this new chapter for this new book on EU solidarity in practice, Brendan Donnelly, he concluded in his chapter on Britain, him elaborating on the British perspective on solidarity, and here more linked with Brexit, that by signing up to the EU treaties, a member state expresses its desire to participate in the process of European integrative solidarity. And with this, I leave you and see you back at 3 o'clock this afternoon, Brussels time, 2 o'clock Lisbon time, and Lisboa time, when we will continue with our parallel sessions at the PPC in Lisboa. Thank you very much and have a good break. Bye-bye.
Thank you.